Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know that people are going to be joining us as we go, but I'm a big believer in starting and ending on time. Everybody's going to have somewhere to go when this is done, and I don't want to delay you for your next thing. So thank you to our hard workers behind the scene, Heidi Doyle, Jenna Wilson, and Inji Hankala, who are handling the waiting room and such matters. We really appreciate your labor. This wouldn't work without you. I'm Dorian Mattingly. I'm the chair of the Department of Women's Studies. And welcome to what has become a regular event when we have elections, gender justice and the 2020 elections. This event is co-sponsored by the Department of Chicano and Chicana Studies and the Department of Political Science. And our goal is to just introduce you to a number of issues around gender and social justice that are relevant in this election, some of which you might already be thinking about and reading about yourself, and some of which might be new perspectives to you. This event is part of our 50th anniversary celebration. In 1970, San Diego State was the first university in the nation to have a women's studies program. And so our 50 years is actually the 50-year anniversary of the discipline of women's studies. So we're very proud of that in general, and you know, all of our programming celebrates that and all that's happened in women's studies over the last 50 years. The format today will be that there are 5 professors, 5 panelists who will talk. We will introduce each other. So once I step away, you won't hear from me again until it's time for me to give my 10-minute talk. This is all being recorded. Other than the presenters, everybody has been muted. If you would like to ask a question, we would like you to submit it in the chat. The chat has been disabled unless, except to and from the hosts. So you'll be sent in the chat a way to submit a question. And then at the end, we're trying to leave a fairly long time for Q&A, because that's kind of where it gets interesting. And so at the end, I will be the person, you know, kind of reads from the questions that you send in to make sure that they go to the various panelists. So be sure and say, you know, whoever it's for, like, you know, this is a question for Professor O'Brien, or this is a question for all the panelists, so that we know. So I think that's all that I need to say. It is being recorded. We have disabled the chat except to and from the hosts. Please submit your questions through chat, and we'll have Q&A for everybody at the end. So if you have a question for the first speaker, go ahead and submit the question while you're thinking about it. And then at the end, we'll take Q&A for all the speakers. I think that covers it. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the first speaker. And the first speaker will be Professor Huma Ahmed-Ghosh from the Department of Women's Studies. And Professor Ahmed-Ghosh will be speaking on the topic of Kamla Harris, diversity and gender in the White House. So join me in welcoming Professor Huma Ahmed-Ghosh.
A big thank you to Dorian Mattingly for organizing this very, very timely and valuable panel. It is indeed an honor to be on a panel with my esteemed colleagues. I do want to start off with an appeal to the students and everybody else on the screen today to please, please, please register to vote. That's the first step, and then to vote. This is for those of you who are, and I can see many of my students are on the screen, who are first-time voters. You are really starting off your political career by voting in an election that has never been more contentious and divided on not just politics, but basic human values and humanity in the US, and an election that is most vital to the survival of the universe. I know I'm sounding very dramatic, but believe me, you will make history if this is your first election. So please get your ballots and submit them as soon as possible. If you have any questions about the process or the ballots or not receiving or what to do with them, please contact any of us on the panel or your professors or anybody you know. I can give you my email and Doreen's and other people's so that we make sure the process is smooth for you. So this is my big appeal to everybody. One would not generally talk about a vice presidential candidate in general because they are not seen necessarily as being as important as the presidential candidate. But in this case, not only is the vice presidential candidate very important, but is also a woman of color. So I really want to focus on Kamla Harris because she is going to set a trend, and if she does get elected, change the complexion, no pun intended, of the White House, which is something maybe we need to change the name there. But also she will change the trajectory of politics in the future. I do not want to deny Obama's contribution to this, but with Kamala Harris, it can go much, much further. So Californians were not surprised, and we were quite excited that Joe Biden picked Kamala Harris to be his running mate. The announcement, interestingly and deliberately, I suppose, fell on the US Martin Luther King Jr. Day, honoring the slain civil rights leader. The day was selected as a reminder of the aspirational fight for justice and progress. Kamala Harris is the first woman of color to run for the vice president on a major party ticket. Going back to the 1800s, we have had women trying to run through small organizations, but this is a major one. If elected in November, she will be the first woman, first African American, and first Asian American vice president in the history of the United States. And for those of us who are a bit dated and older, a thought came to me just now, which is that Shirley Chisholm must be smiling from above. Chisholm was the first Black woman to seek presidential nomination in the Democratic Party in 1972. This is a very important election for the largest number of reasons that if I had to enumerate would take the whole day. But with Kamala Harris's nomination, the importance of the vice presidential position becomes even more relevant. The vice president should be as equally at least qualified as the presidential candidate, because in the unfortunate eventuality of the president becoming incapacitated, it is the vice president who steps in. The vice president has influence on the president on most issues and is the conscience of the president. Lastly, the vice president is the understudy who is trained to run for president in the next cycle. Therefore, for the White House and the US, a woman of color is a historical achievement that will not just speak volumes to where the country is headed, but will be the beginning of a serious regrouping of values and laws, finally aimed at social, gender, and racial justice, amongst other issues. Political insiders often note that the most important thing about the choice of a vice president is what it says about the judgment and priorities of the person at the top of the ticket. In the case of Joe Biden's choice of Kamala Harris, it says that Biden is not afraid of strong women, that he believes the top levels of his administration should look more like America, that he does not hold petty grudges, embracing Harris even though, perhaps even because, she had the audacity to challenge him in a primary debate. The very fact of putting a woman of color and the daughter of immigrants on the ticket is a direct rebuke of Trump's "Make America Great Again," shorthand for a return to what Trump seems to revere as a golden era when selecting someone like Harris would have been out of the question. When Biden announced that he would pick a woman to be his running mate, it narrowed his options, but many, many options remained. To name a few, the list was pretty long. Val Demings, Tammy Duckworth, Susan Rice, Karen Bass, and currently there are also 9 Black women mayors in the country. So just to point out that there is no shortage of women of color to run for high office in this country. Biden and Harris took the pledge to strive for gender parity in all senior national security appointments. Choosing Harris is a great step to fulfilling that commitment. Biden has promised to go further if elected, and perhaps he will appoint a woman to other positions that have never seen a woman, especially a woman of color. But we need to be cautious. Though an important step, senior appointments will not be enough to overcome decades of inequality. What I have learned in politics is that to achieve gender parity and racial equity, Biden and Harris will need to implement a system grounded in grassroots commitment and accountability. Democratic vice presidential candidate Harris's ascension makes her the first Black female nominee of a major US party. She has Jamaican and Indian heritage, and so therefore the Asian American part of her, but not just her ethnic background will win over the Black Lives Matter protesters and African Americans who have taken to the streets this year. Harris stands at a crowded intersection of identities that are multivaried. She has been referred to as biracial, bicultural, bi-heritage, all this bi-language, though I would prefer to refer to her as a hybridized ideal who defines current America. Senator Harris has shown that she is ready to use her family background as a political asset, and she should. It is also a shout out to single mothers who worked and sacrificed to raise two independent and strong daughters. Her mother chose Kamla's name as a nod to her Indian roots. Kamla means lotus. It is another name for the Hindu goddess Lakshmi and the empowerment of women. As her mother said in a recent interview, a culture that worships goddesses produces strong women. Senator Harris has a chance to show again that there are plenty of qualified candidates from diverse backgrounds who are too often passed over. For example, for other Black women who have made it to the highest levels of their fields, having Kamla Harris as a vice president is more than historic. They say she will strengthen conversations about workplace diversity in the US at a time when pay and race disparities are more important than ever. She would break barriers if she's elected, and it will also make it, even though change will not come immediately, it will make it harder to ignore issues of race and class. She's also going to be an important role model because as a Black woman leader said, Harris is good at what she does, and it shows how the country has evolved. She should not be expected to solve the country's racial issues, but her presence will change the conversation. While Harris' election is historic, it's still an anomaly. This is the case for so many who have been the first. They have an added burden to succeed. If they don't, you know there won't be another one like them for many years to come. Kamla Harris has demonstrated a commitment to the LGBT community. In the early part of her career, there were some policies that she supported which were not very supportive of the LGBT community, but since then she has emerged as a staunch supporter of the LGBT community, and her record is excellent since then, and she has been endorsed by most of the LGBT organizations in the country, and she was extremely vocal in not defending Proposition 8, which was the constitutional ban on same-sex marriage enacted at the ballot in 2008. After the US Supreme Court restored to marriage equality in California in 2013, Kamla Harris officiated the first wedding of Chris Perry and Sandy Steer of Berkeley, the first same-sex marriage performed in California after the landmark decision. Of course, Harris does not have a perfect record. She has been rightfully criticized for supporting the state prison system in refusing to grant transgender surgery to inmates, but since then has reversed her policies and she has also been criticized for filling prisons at one time. But we have seen that over the years, she has not only made amends, but made prison reform a top priority. She has also been criticized for supporting some corporate interests. So I'm not going to say that she's a saint. Her campaign will focus, though, on reducing the high cost of living with a middle class tax credit, pursuing immigration and criminal justice changes, and a Medicare for all healthcare system. As one of the earliest congressional critics of President Trump's immigration policies, Harris has pushed hard for a deal to protect from deportation those immigrants who came to the country illegally as children, a group known as Dreamers. She has also pushed back against critics of identity politics, who she says are using the term as a pejorative or to marginalize issues of race, gender, and sexual orientation. To quote Kamla Harris, it is used to try and shut us up. She spoke about this at a conference of liberal activists last summer. She's also not a fan of being called the female Obama. When a reporter asked her about carrying on Obama's legacy during her run for president, she said, "I have my own legacy." To end, her motto comes from her mother, who said to Kamla, "You may be the first, but make sure you're not the last." So on that note, I want to end my brief discussion of the value of the vice president and to reiterate to please vote and make sure that she gets to the White House, because maybe one of the ways we get the first woman president is if the president takes leave. So let's go out and vote. Thank you. Now I want to introduce the next speaker, who is Professor Dorian Mattingly. She is chair of the Department of Women's Studies and president of the CFA. Her talk is titled "The Senate and Supreme Court, Female Judges and Gender Justice." So you can guess what she's going to talk about.
Thank you very much, Huma. And just a reminder for people who have joined us, if you have a question for any of the speakers, please put it in the chat to Heidi Doyle. We'll do Q&A at the end to everybody, and this event is being recorded. So just reminders for people who joined us late. Okay, there's a lot to say on this topic, so I'm gonna get going. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away on Friday, September 18th at the age of 87. Ginsburg was appointed in 1993 by President Bill Clinton, and in recent years served as the most senior member of the court's liberal wing, consistently delivering progressive votes and scathing dissenting opinions on the most divisive social issues of the day, including abortion rights, same-sex marriage, voting rights, immigration, healthcare, and affirmative action. Before her appointment to the court, Ginsburg was co-founder of the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU, where she authored the strategy of extending the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to include gender discrimination. Because the Equal Rights Amendment was not ratified, the precedent set by Ginsburg's arguments is the only constitutional protection for the equal treatment of men and women. A week after Ginsburg's death, in an event widely believed to be a super spreader of coronavirus, President Donald Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett to fill her court seat. This Monday, October 12th, 2 days ago, the Senate Judiciary Committee began its confirmation hearings. They hope to complete the hearings and bring the nomination to the full Senate for a confirmation vote before the November 3rd election. Because Republicans are in the majority in the Senate, they are able to determine the timeline, and they have the votes to confirm her regardless of the opposition of Democrats. The decision of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to begin the confirmation process just 22 days before the election is particularly infuriating to Democrats because 4 years ago, McConnell refused to allow the Senate to even consider Barack Obama's Supreme Court nominee, Judge Merrick Garland, 8 months ahead of the election. Amy Coney Barrett is a former University of Notre Dame law professor who was appointed by Trump in 2017 as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. Barrett is white, 48 years old, a devout Catholic, and as anyone watching the confirmation hearing has been told repeatedly, the mother of 7 children, 2 of whom were adopted from Haiti. Like Trump's other Supreme Court appointees, Barrett is extremely conservative. Despite her insistence that she will decide each case based on the law and not her personal ideology, Barrett's appointment will move the court further to the right. She's already issued very conservative opinions on gun rights and immigration cases, and her academic writings have led both liberals and conservatives to believe that she would be willing to vote to overturn Roe versus Wade. Indeed, her appointment has been loudly cheered by anti-abortion groups. Meanwhile, progressive groups have expressed alarm over Barrett's previous statements critical of the Affordable Care Act and the Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage. Democrats are especially concerned that Trump and McConnell are rushing to confirm Barrett before the election to ensure a majority of justices will support Trump if the election results go to the Supreme Court. Whether or not Amy Coney Barrett weighs in on the election as a justice, her nomination and confirmation are completely about the election. Trump's announcement that he would only consider women for the seat is part of a strategy to improve his growing unpopularity with female voters. Although the majority of white women voted for Trump in 2016, polls show that support is slipping. White suburban women in particular are key swing voters in this election. Now, when people ask me, why do so many white women support Trump? My answer is often, well, one reason is because they're white. We all have intersectional identities, and in many cases, our racial and ethnic identities determine our behavior more than our gender. So some white women support Trump for exactly the same reasons that their husbands and brothers do. Support for Trump is slipping among white women, however, for reasons that do not seem to affect men as much. In particular, surveys show that white suburban women are much more critical than men of Trump's bullying, dishonesty, and grandiosity. They are also much more impacted by his failure of leadership in the pandemic, as women are more likely than men to be caring for sick family members, to be helping children learn from home, and to have permanently lost their jobs. To win these white women back, Trump first rolled out a racist law and order campaign, tweeting about the threats that Democrats pose to neighborhoods and the safety of white suburban housewives. Now Trump has nominated a justice his team hopes will appeal to conservative white women who are much more likely than other women to believe a couple of things. One, that gender discrimination is a thing of the past, and two, that a focus on family and children by women is best for society. Barrett seems to embody these beliefs. Although she admits that she has benefited from the anti-discrimination work of Ginsburg and others, she does not herself challenge sexism. Instead, she belongs to a small, charismatic Christian group called People of Praise that emphasizes women's, and this is a quote, obedience to authority and submission to headship. The Federalist, a conservative publication, praises Barrett for her example of, quote, how strong women submit to their husbands with joy. I'm not sure who Joy is and how she figures in, but you get the idea. Barrett's 7 children, as well as the work she did helping to raise her siblings, was a topic that Republican senators have and continue to today return to over and over in the Senate confirmation hearings. Mentioning the judge's children is an attempt to make her seem more warm and compassionate, and therefore more moderate than her record suggests. For example, Republican Senator Chuck Grassley called claims that Barrett would not support the Affordable Care Act, quote, outrageous, and asserted that, quote, as a mother of 7, Judge Barrett clearly understands the importance of healthcare. The many references to Barrett's children also communicated praise that her ambition has not interfered with her womanly duty. But as any observer of modern political life knows, such admiration is limited to white women only. A woman of color would be attacked and demeaned for having such a large family, regardless of her job. The confirmation hearings this week have also put the spotlight, once again, on the relationship of conservative women to feminism. Certainly, some powerful women think that Barrett's nomination is deserving of praise from all women, especially feminists. For example, Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, a Republican member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, began her comments with this: "You'd think my colleagues on the left would jump at the opportunity to support a successful female legal superstar who is a working mom." And Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, the other Republican woman on the Judiciary Committee and someone in danger of losing her Senate seat in November, praised Barrett's choices, proclaiming, quote, "The great freedom of being an American woman is that we can decide how to build our lives, whom to marry, what kind of person we are, and where we want to go. We don't have to fit the narrow definition of womanhood. We create our own path." This version of women's advancement that portrays the career success of an individual woman, especially one who is white and elite, as an accomplishment for all women, is based on a flawed belief that if feminists are for women's empowerment, they must support all groundbreaking women. This is a claim and a belief that is dangerous to women into feminism and must be refuted. If Barrett even defines herself as a feminist, which seems unlikely, her versions of empowerment and choice do not extend to other women, particularly those who do not share her privileges as a white, wealthy, straight, able-bodied, cisgendered woman. In terms of her personal life, Amy Coney Barrett has, quote, created her own path of a high-powered career to 7 small children because of the unpaid labor of female family members and the poorly paid labor of countless housekeepers, babysitters, and other domestic workers. To imply that making good choices is the only reason women succeed is to completely obscure the many ways that power and privilege work in women's lives. It also ignores the power and control of the lives of other women that Barrett will have of Supreme Court justice. As Monica Hesse writes in her Washington Post column, the question is not whether Barrett is a woman. It's not even whether she supports women. The question is whether the judge, as a member of the highest court in the land, will interpret the law in a way that will allow women to support themselves, close quote. Barrett's opposition to abortion, to immigrant rights, to LGBTQ+ rights, all suggest that her interpretation of the law will reduce the ability of many women to govern their own medical care, control what happens to their body, choose when and whether to have children, to have meaningful jobs and families, and in some cases to even stay in the US. Finally, a word about her judicial philosophy. Amy Coney Barrett calls herself an originalist, which means she pledges to interpret the Constitution as understood by the framers and the public at the time it was written. The irony of a woman committed to the literal interpretation of the text of a document that grants rights only to property-owning men baffles the mind, since a truly literal interpretation would mean that a woman could not vote, much less serve as judge. Numerous originalist judges, including Barrett's mentor, former Justice Antonin Scalia, argued that a strict originalist interpretation of the Constitution would reverse the interpretation of the Equal Opportunity Clause in the 14th Amendment that has given women equal rights, the interpretation that is Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legacy and the only constitutional protection of equal rights for women. Finally, Barrett, like all of Trump's judicial appointees, is recommended by the Federalist Society, a conservative group dedicated to the appointment of conservatives to the court. The Federalist Society is certainly pro-life and the champion of a brand of religious freedom used to legitimate discrimination against the LGBTQ community, but they are first and foremost opposed to government regulation of the economy. Their interest is in a court system that defends the rights of corporations and those who profit from their excesses. The appointment of conservative judges is a strategy to overturn laws and policies that provide safety nets to vulnerable people and that protect workers, the environment, and consumers. Barrett's nomination is one more step in the corporate capture of the courts, and it will help to entrench the power of corporations over all of us. Thank you. And now after that cheerful talk, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Victoria González-Rivera from the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies, who will speak on the topic of Latinx voters and Trump. And if you have questions for me or for any other speaker, please send them through the chat and we will do Q&A after all the speakers have talked. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to go ahead and share some statistics on Latinx populations in the United States, and then I'm going to have a list of the reasons why some Latinx individuals support Trump, and then a list of why Latinx individuals should not support Trump. So there's a lot of information. Some of this is data that we're already familiar with, but I always find that going over it again, I always am surprised by how different it is from the propaganda that comes out of the White House, right? So one of the main takeaways from my 10 minutes, let me start my clock here, is that the Latinx population in the United States is not homogeneous, right? And so the implications of that. Okay, so to start off with, I just want to point out that the term Latino or Latinx is an umbrella term meant to include peoples of Latin American ancestry in the United States, but of course these are problematic terms, right? But the least problematic in terms of those available as umbrella terms. So the X is meant to be gender inclusive and potentially gender disruptive. So there are approximately 60 million Latinxes in the country. I'm going to use Latinxes, even though it might sound funny to some of us, making up approximately 18% of the overall US population, and approximately 80% of all Latinxes are US citizens. What this means is, of course, that then potentially, right, we have a lot of eligible Latino Latinx voters. Slightly under half of all Latinxes identify as Catholic, and they make up over a third of all US Catholics. Approximately 30% of Latinxes are non-Catholic Christians. Almost a quarter of Latinxes are religiously unaffiliated. The largest group that falls under the category of Latinx are peoples of Mexican ancestry, including Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx populations. Mexican origin populations make up 62% of the overall Latinx population. Puerto Ricans living on the mainland make up approximately 10% of the overall Latinx population, and they're the second largest group. By the way, again, these are the sorts of things that we all know, but I think it's important to be reminded of. Puerto Ricans, of course, who live in Puerto Rico are not allowed to vote for US president because, of course, Puerto Rico is a US territory. Then we have, in terms of numbers, right, we have people of Cuban, Salvadoran, and Dominican ancestry. Each make up approximately 4% of the overall Latinx population, followed by Guatemalans, Hondurans, and Colombians, right? People of those ancestries that each make up about 2% of the overall Latinx population in the United States. And it's very important to note that approximately 25% of Latinxes in the US identify as Afro-Latinx. Currently, approximately 32 million Latinxes are eligible to vote. That means that we make up 13% of the eligible voters in the United States currently. And it also means that about half of Latinxes in the US are eligible to vote. Currently, approximately 62% of Latinx registered voters identify as Democrat or lean towards the Democratic Party, and approximately 34% are registered as Republicans or identify as Republicans or lean towards the Republican Party. So how do Latinx voters compare to other groups? 54% of non-Hispanic white voters identified as Republicans in 2018. The number has remained pretty stable. 23% of Asian Americans have identified as Republicans as recently as 2018 for the last elections. And approximately 9% of non-Hispanic African American voters have identified as Republicans. So what we see then is a Republican Party that's highly white. There's also a gender gap among Latinx voters, just like there is basically among all racialized groups, right? So in every single racial category, women are more likely to vote for a Democratic candidate than for a Republican. And although the gender gap is most pronounced among white voters, it is also significant among Latinx voters. Latinos, although they make up 13% of the electorate, right, that percentage varies by state. And again, this is something that we know intuitively, but here are some of the statistics. So in New Mexico, for example, they make up 43% of the electorate, in California, 30%, in Texas, 30%, in Arizona, 24%, in Florida, 20%, and in Nevada, 19%. So those are very high percentages, right? Now, those happen to also be the states that have the largest percentages overall of Latinx individuals, right? And another thing that people often forget to realize, or we know, but we just forget, right? Because in part of the propaganda, is that over 70% of Latinxes in the United States are fluent in English. So what we can see then is that the Latinx community is not at all homogeneous, right? And the projection is, not surprisingly, that approximately 30% of Latinx voters will vote for Trump, will continue to vote for the Republicans as they have in previous elections. Okay, so who are these Latinos, Latinxes who are voting for Trump? So evangelical Christian Latinx voters, like evangelical Christian voters in general, tend to support Trump in high numbers. Trump has a relatively high degree of support among Latinos of Cuban, Venezuelan, and Nicaraguan origin. For example, 2/3 of the Venezuelan vote, 60% of the Cuban American vote is going to most likely go to Trump, right? Not surprisingly. Trump also has the support of many Latinos, Latinxes who work in law enforcement, who work for the prison industrial system, and who work for the Department of Homeland Security. Trump also has the support of Latinxes who have been lured by the false and ridiculous conspiracies of QAnon. And Trump also, and this is very, very, very important, has the support of Latinxes who are anti-Black and anti-immigrant. So why should Latinxes not vote for Trump, right? So we already know why then some Latinxes are going to vote for Trump, but why shouldn't we? Well, Trump has separated thousands of refugee families to the point where nearly 70,000 immigrant children, many of them Latinx, were held in US custody at some point in 2019 alone. Trump has targeted birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants. This means that traditionally in the United States, right, if you are born in the United States, you are a US citizen, but Trump, as well as Trump's supporters, have argued that that shouldn't be the case for the children of undocumented immigrants. Trump has also already taken action to end DACA for almost 1 million DACA recipients, many of whom are Latinx. Trump has also taken action to end the Affordable Care Act, which will disproportionately affect Latinx individuals. Trump has also already taken action to end the pre-existing conditions clause of the Affordable Care Act, which will also disproportionately affect Latinx populations, because in part because the Latinx populations in the United States tend to have higher rates of poverty. Trump has also taken action to end the Affordable Care Act clause that currently allows parents to cover their children on their insurance until they turn 26, which again will also disproportionately affect Latinx individuals. And Trump has also taken action to end TPS, the temporary protected status for specific immigrant groups, among them Salvadorans. And Trump's failed response to COVID has led to Latinxes dying in disproportionate numbers, right? So currently 1 in every 1,540 Latinxes has died of COVID. In other words, I argue that we as Latinxes, as peoples of Latin American ancestry, right, must vote as if our lives depend on it, because they do. Thank you. I am now going to introduce the person who follows me, and that is Professor Cheryl O'Brien from the Department of Political Science. And the title of her presentation today is A Broader Gendered Picture, Democracy versus Authoritarianism.
Thank you. What I want to talk about first is some findings on the elections from 2016 from the New Political Science Journal, Journal of Politics and Culture. And what I want to argue is at stake in this election domestically, but also globally because of the implications of US power globally. What is at stake is US as a hallmark of democracy, or reaching towards an ideal of democracy. And democracy is a process. Findings show that those who are less educated are more likely to favor authoritarianism compared to those who are more educated. Pulling from this peer-reviewed literature, I note, crucial to the development of the political subject is the value afforded education throughout the social and discursive environments in which subjectivity is cultivated. Education taken here as the most decisive variable determining voter directionality in 2016. The most shocking statistic is this: 66% of white people without a college degree voted for Trump. 66%. Clinton got only 29% of these votes. The contrast between non-college and college-educated white people and with whom they voted for is too considerable to ignore. David Rothkopf writes, Trump won power because his supporters are threatened by what they don't understand. Indeed, from evolution to data about our economy, to the science of vaccines, to the threats we face in the world, they reject subjects rooted in fact in order to have reality conform to their worldviews. They don't dig for truth. They skim the media for anything that makes them feel better about themselves. To many of them, knowledge is not a useful tool, but a cunning barrier intellectual elites have created to keep power from the average man and woman. The same is true for experience, skills, and expertise. These things require time and work and study, and often challenge our systems of belief. Truth is hard, shallowness is easy. Jason Brennan further remarks, never have educated voters so uniformly rejected a candidate, but never before have the lesser educated so uniformly supported a candidate. What is Trumpism then? Democracy requires a citizenry educated in matters of civics, participation in public elections, and puts a high premium on citizenship. Trumpism is the result of an indifferent American public increasingly oblivious to the difference between political fact and fiction, and a citizenry that does not seem to recognize, nor does it care to understand, why this heedlessness and indifference to politics is problematic in the first place. As Wolin put it, quote, every apathetic citizen is a silent enlistee in the calls of inverted totalitarianism, end quote. And this really signals what Trumpism is warning us of, and what I would argue is a pattern or a movement towards authoritarianism versus true democracy. When we think about democracy in its truest sense, we would expect equality and a focus on getting rid of systemic inequalities. However, we even have an Attorney General, Barr, who has denied the existence of systemic racism. And these are appointees by Trump. The far right, of course, denies systemic racism and systemic inequalities in general in the United States. I'll give you some examples of the far right that has supported Trump and this far right push within the Republican Party. The Knights of Columbus, the Knights of the KKK is opposed to all groups that threaten white Christianity, including non-whites, homosexuals, immigrants, and non-Christians. The KKK's party website states, thanks to the foresight of fathers, America has held out the longest against the global race-mixing, homosexual, anti-Christ forces working to wipe out white Christianity the way we have always known it. And I want to point out this far-right emphasis on the founding fathers of the United States, some of whom we know had slaves. We also know that even in response to women's rights, of course, not only were women denied equal citizenship, but also you have examples of speaking about hyper-masculine kind of systems that represent this old school way of thinking. And John Adams replied to his wife, Abigail Adams, who requested to him, quote, remember the ladies and do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. John Adams, a founding father, replied, I cannot but laugh. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. So I challenge those who like to cite the founding fathers as if they are a hallmark of democracy in its truest sense. Democracy, again, is a process, and we want to continue evolving and moving forward, just like we have with human rights discourse in international relations. The Knights of the KKK also adhere to an imperial proclamation that promotes patriotism and manhood. The Constitution and laws of the KKK restricts membership to a white male genteel person, a native-born citizen of the US. The KKK strongly supports traditional family values and often speaks of the sanctity of womanhood. In the Imperial Proclamation, all men who qualify are invited, quote, to share with us the glory of performing the sacred duty of protecting womanhood, end quote. So comments about Mexican immigrants, for example, by Trump when he was running for office for his first term, referring to Mexicans in derogatory ways, including some as rapists. This really is a dog whistle to members of the KKK and other far-right groups that claim to protect womanhood from non-white men. KKK's belief in the need to control white women's bodies has been to ensure the survival of the white race. The KKK has supported and partaken in a wide variety of authoritarian and anti-democratic practices in order to preserve white Christianity. Another group that has supported President Trump and this push within the Republican Party to the far right is the alt-right. It is a new, loosely connected group of movements in the US that encompasses far-right and white nationalist ideologies, groups, and individuals. The core belief of the alt-right is that white identity is under attack by multicultural forces. The alt-right is opposed to multiculturalism, immigration, feminism, political correctness, and anyone who supports those ideals. The alt-right also views non-whites and Jews as a threat to their white identity. In a Breitbart column, far-right political commentator Milo Yiannopoulos co-authored an unofficial guide to the alt-right. In the column, he describes the alt-right as a mix of smaller movements or groups that have united to protect their own demographic, quote, tribe of young white males. One of the sub-movements within the alt-right is the Manosphere, a men's rights group created to counter feminist movement. Most supporters of this group promote extremely misogynistic views and embrace toxic masculinity. Many alt-right members have even claimed that women desire to be ruled by men. Prominent alt-right leader and founder of the neo-Nazi website Daily Stormer, Andrew Anglin, advocates for domestic violence and supports violence against women. Men's rights activists and white supremacists within this sub-movement argue that feminism and women's liberation has actually damaged the prosperity of the white race because it allows women to make their own choice about their sexual partners and whether or not to have children. Among groups with a white supremacist ideology, there is a core belief to have control over white women's bodies in order to preserve their white race. In 2017, 2 psychologists conducted a study on supporters of the alt-right and found that on average, alt-right supporters viewed minorities and non-whites as less human and less evolved than whites. They also found that most supporters have shown personality traits associated with right-wing authoritarianism. So again, this is anti-democratic. The alt-right is filled with a wide range of members, many of whom are non-violent online trolls. However, there are still members willing to engage in violence and authoritarian practices in order to win the culture war. Again, these have been supporters of President Trump and the push for the far right within the Republican Party. A particular faction of the Republican Party called the House Freedom Caucus has managed to replace mainstream center-right policies with far-right and radical right ideas. And the election of Trump has helped expedite the rightward shift in ideology within the Republican Party. Trump's America First platform has enacted various types of legislation negatively affecting women's rights, LGBT rights, and civil rights for minority populations. They have made disparaging remarks about LGBT rights. And they have upheld traditional values, including traditional family values said to be rooted in the Bible. In the 2016 Republican platform, there was very clear statement of pro-traditional family and anti-LGBT stance entitled Defending Marriage Against an Activist Judiciary. So the court system being very much part of their agenda and their strategic agenda. In 2019, Republicans voted against renewing the Violence Against Women Act. This is an act that supports men, women, and children. I have worked for domestic violence agencies myself and rape crisis agencies, and we serve men, women, and children. But Republicans voted against renewing the Violence Against Women Act in 2019, arguing that prohibiting domestic abusers from owning firearms violates their Second Amendment rights. A domestic violence abuser with a firearm is very dangerous. If anyone should have their firearms removed, it would be a domestic abuser who has threatened their partner or their children with a firearm. The Republican Party has a long history of opposing any form of tyrannical and authoritarian government. However, the party's views have shifted over the past few years. Since Trump began campaigning for president, more and more voters with authoritarian views have flooded into the Republican Party. Since taking office, Trump and the Republican Party have implemented a travel ban against several Muslim-majority countries, targeted refugees and immigrants from South America and the Middle East, and worked to erode civil rights for minorities. The Republican Party has worked continuously to prevent women and minorities from receiving equal rights by blocking anti-discrimination bills, denying equal pay, and establishing restrictive voter laws. The Republican Party's majority in the Senate has also allowed the president to engage in misconduct with impunity. I want to add, from an international perspective, a lot of my work I do abroad in developing nations. And feminist foreign policy, such as Sweden's and what we might espouse or idealize, would include global gender equality. However, this is under attack and threat by the far right within the United States government. And one example of this is the gag rule. In my own work on the ground in Nigeria and other countries on the continent of Africa and elsewhere, women have talked to me about the fear that they have to even speak out on reproductive rights, to speak out publicly, to participate in peaceful protests. And these are in countries that are democratizing nations, nations that the US and our US aid supports financially to create more stable democracies on the continent of Africa and elsewhere in developing regions. Yet, if we are thwarting women's rights and silencing women from even participating in peaceful protests with orders that are very partisan, that come from the Republican Party, the global gag rule on even protesting on reproductive rights, we are thwarting democracy. We are silencing women's voices. And this is in more way than one. But that is one example where women told me, even though they are feminists, they are activists, they are working so hard on violence against women and various issues, they have said they cannot speak up on reproductive rights or even protest because they know in the US, the administration switched down the road in different years. And what they were referring to was specifically the Republican Party's support of a global gag that bans women and silences their voices, bans women from protesting peacefully on reproductive rights. What is my time? How much time do I have?
You're over time.
Okay, I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor O'Brien. I believe I'm the last speaker, so I'll just go ahead. So hi, everyone. My name is Megan Welsh. I'm an associate professor in the School of Public Affairs, which is criminal justice, public administration, and city planning. I'm super excited to be part of this discussion. I'm not in Cal, I'm in PSFA, a fellow friendly college. And so I'm happy to be here with you all to talk about issues of gender and justice in this election. So in my work, I study and teach about issues related to the criminalization of homelessness, poverty, police behavior, in particular, police racial profiling, and kind of the very frayed relationships that local police departments have with communities of color and the policing of people experiencing homelessness. And so what I'd like to share with you today is some of my thoughts around discussions that are happening at the federal level, but I'd like to spend most of my time sharing with you what I find hopeful in this moment around what's happening at the local level. And so I'll try to make a graceful connection between those two, but bear with me. So Professor Ghosh started us off with a conversation around how Kamala Harris is, I believe the words she used are a hybridized ideal. And so the first thing I want to share with you is, I think that Kamala as a candidate is such a fascinating case study in how challenging it can be to be a reformer working within a system like our criminal legal system. I won't use justice here because justice is not served in our current system quite often. So it's complicated to be a reformer working in this system. And then there are added layers of complexity, as Professor Ghosh noted, around being a woman of color, working in a system that from many perspectives right now, we can see as a tool of white supremacy and as the persistent oppression of poor people and people of color. And I'll also note here that women have for several decades been the fastest growing segment of our US prison population. So when we talk about justice and our criminal legal system, we're talking about gendered issues alongside these other issues that have been raised. So I just want to quickly highlight for you some things that are really interesting to me about Kamala when we think about criminal justice reform or defunding, particularly of police departments, or of abolishing these entities altogether. So historically, folks may know that Kamala got her start as a prosecutor. She served as the district attorney in San Francisco for 7 years, starting in 2004. And then she served as our state's top prosecutor. And in her own words, she described herself as our state's top cop. She served as the Attorney General for the state of California from 2011 to 2017. And at that time, Kamala actually portrayed herself as a progressive prosecutor. And this term, progressive prosecutor, did not exist back then in the way that it does now. And so she did really fascinating and quite cutting edge things during these points in her career. One example, when she was serving as the San Francisco district attorney, she declined to pursue the death penalty for the killer of a police officer. And she did so even as she received intense criticism from Democrats like Dianne Feinstein. So she has really stuck to her views around the death penalty and the need to abolish it. She developed cutting edge diversion programs to keep young people who had had criminal legal contact in school and working. One of the exciting things for me as a criminal justice researcher is that she developed this database called Open Justice, where we can now get a pretty much real-time or up-to-date, frequently up-to-date statistics on both crime and police use of force statistics. And this is for the state of California, and this is the legacy that she left as Attorney General. But as Professor Ghosh also noted, as I previously mentioned, she has also positioned herself as a top cop. And so some of these views and some of these activities are where, if the election goes the way that many of us hope it will, and there is a Biden-Harris administration for us to contend with, these are areas where we can apply pressure, both locally and at the federal level, to push for more reform. So I mentioned the reform, defund, abolish kind of movement or spectrum earlier. For folks who aren't kind of tuned into those conversations, reform means trying to build back legitimacy in a system that other folks are kind of arguing is irreparably broken. And so Kamala would position herself as a reformer. She says that the criminal legal system is broken, but that it can be fixed. And she talks about these in terms of getting a better reinvestment on the resources that we put into the system, citing statistics like our 70% recidivism rate. 70% of the folks that we incarcerate end up returning to incarceration at some point in their lives. So Kamala is solidly over there, but we've got movements to defund and abolish that if she and Biden get elected, these are where the conversations are going to be happening, I guess is my point. And so defund is kind of the middle ground where folks are pushing for ideas like the police are taking on way too much responsibility that does not have direct effect on crime. So issues like things I work on, like homelessness, police officers should not be the first point of contact for someone experiencing homelessness, someone experiencing a mental health crisis, right? So the idea with defund is to remove funding from police departments where they're taking on more social service responsibilities and putting those in the hands of more capable professionals. And then there's the Abolish Movement. A lot of folks want to abolish parts, if not all, of our existing criminal legal system, starting with police departments, and completely reimagine what a system of public safety and community accountability would look like. And so I would argue that Kamala, in her very kind of complicated positioning as both a progressive prosecutor and a top cop, it has certainly characterized herself as willing to take on tough reform matters, but I think that they're going to need pressure, I guess is my point. So her platform now seems to be around scaling back incarceration. There could be some stronger language there, ending the death penalty and solitary confinement, banning private prisons, and getting rid of cash bail. So these are all exciting positions for a major candidate to be taking. I should say that it is particularly remarkable and kind of important to point out the context in which both Biden and Harris kind of came up the ranks during the high crime 80s and the tough on crime 90s. And so we see these profound shifts that are happening, particularly amongst liberal candidates on issues like criminal justice. And a lot of folks on the left would push that we need a lot more of that, right? Another note I'll make around kind of criminal legal reform, defunding, abolishing at the federal level is that, in my view, there has not been enough conversation about the economy, the pandemic, and its effects on low and very low income people. And these are the people who are most likely to be not only affected by the pandemic economically, women and people of color are more likely to have precarious, low wage, essential work positions, and to be experiencing unemployment in this moment. And that is a dangerous intersection with our criminal legal system, which is often used as a way of controlling the poor and of managing mental health issues. So with that, I would like to transition into alerting you to some issues that are happening at our state and local level around these topics, so that if you're interested, you can follow up and do some more research. So in our criminal legal world, the propositions that are most of interest, first of all, Proposition 20 would reverse a decade of criminal justice reform here in the state of California. Professor Ghosh alluded to kind of Kamala's evolution during this time, where she oversaw, somewhat unwillingly on her part at first, a massive downsizing of our drastically overcrowded prison system. And Proposition 20 looks to undo some of those efforts, and to undo some of the efforts of Proposition 47, which passed in 2014 and downgraded some felonies, poverty-related felonies, I would note, theft-related crimes like repeat shoplifting, passing fake checks, things like that. These sorts of offenses under Proposition 20 would be reversed. They would be taken from misdemeanors to felonies. People would get longer prison sentences for these offenses. And this is a very concerning proposition if you're interested in criminal justice reform. It would also allow DNA samples to be collected of people convicted of some misdemeanor offenses, which may be concerning to you. On a brighter note, Prop 17 would restore voting rights for folks who have served a prison term. So I encourage you to check that out. And then the initiative that I am most jazzed about at the local level for folks who live in the city of San Diego, Measure B amends our city charter to develop a commission on police practices. We currently have a community review board, but it does not have any sort of legal power to hold the police department accountable. So this commission on police practices would have its own staff, it would have subpoena power, it would have independent legal counsel, and the authority to investigate police officer misconduct, review complaints against officers, and make recommendations on officer discipline, and all those sorts of good things. And so if you're interested in any of these initiatives and how they fit with broader conversations around our criminal legal system, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I can also share some resources through the chat if folks are interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you to all of our speakers. And we talked fast because we wanted to have time for Q&A. And so I want to remind everybody to submit their questions through the chat. We already have a few that I'm going to get started with. And so speakers, when I direct a question at you, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. And some of them are going to actually be aimed at more than one person. And actually, the first question is one of those. I'd like for Huma and for Megan to talk about, Harris is in this unusual position relative to Black Lives Matter and to police reform movement because she's both a prosecutor and a person of color. And so she gets criticism both from the right and from the left. And how do you think she manages this tension, and how does it impact her candidacy?
Go for it.
Maybe I'll ask Megan to talk to it more, and maybe if there are other questions with Kamla Harris, I can answer those.
Yeah, I think that it is an imperfect tension, and I think that what makes me feel hopeful is that she has certainly evolved on a number of issues. As Professor Ghosh pointed out, I believe she really changed her perspective on trans inmates' rights. At one point, she blocked medical procedure for a trans inmate in a kind of high-profile case. And I think more recently, she has come out as much more in favor of LGBTQ rights and rights of people in the criminal legal system in particular. And so that gives me hope that these positions are malleable because we've already seen them be malleable in the past. As I mentioned, a lot of the criticism that Kamala receives from the left is around actions and decisions and positions that she voiced, more than a decade ago. And our collective understanding of the criminal legal system and of racial dynamics and disparities within it have really evolved. And so she has certainly gotten on board. I don't think folks are thinking that she's kind of leading the progressive movement, but it seems to me like she could be a potential ally, at least on particular issues.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Victoria, oh, did you want to add something, Huma?
Just, that I'm very hopeful only because she's so young and she's changed her, she's become more and more progressive and she listens, she hears. I mean, she has spoken up against, she has spoken up about banning the chokes and about for the prisons, the racial profiling, more knock warrants. She's also been really concerned that the cops that were responsible for Breonna Taylor were not, charged or condemned. So I'm hearing at least something that, this is high office and of course nobody's perfect, but can we trust her is the question for me. And at this point, I would say I would, yeah.
Thank you. This question is for Professor González-Rivera. This is a question that wants you to go more in depth about why Latinx people support Trump. Do they vote because it comes from a place of ignorance? And the questioner writes, because I'm honestly confused, how can they vote for someone who despises them?
Thank you for that question. So in many ways, Doreen, it's similar to what you talked about, right? Why would so many white women support Trump, right? When apparently, right, for some of us, there appears to be a conflict of interest there. Mm-hmm. So that's a very good question, and let me respond to it, right? So what we have under this umbrella term, and that's why I really wanted to focus on the problematic nature of trying to lump all Latinx peoples into one category, right? Because of course we are so diverse. So there's that. So, the thing about Trump is that Trump is a wannabe, is an authoritarian wannabe dictator, right? So he has these authoritarian tendencies, and I don't think we can really talk about a Trumpist ideology per se, but rather whatever serves his best interest, right? And so I mentioned that because what Trump has done in terms of Latinx populations, I'm not sure what he really thinks, right? I'm in terms of Latinos and Latinx individuals, but this is more of a tool for him to obtain more power, right? Because he understands that the people who support him are racist, and therefore he is going to then racist, particularly in terms of this conversation against Latinx individuals, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that it's a utilitarian sort of tool that Trump is using. So in terms of why then Latinos would support Trump, it is because of who we are as a group, right? So individuals who come from Latin America, so for example, individuals who've come to the US from Venezuela or from Cuba or from some from Nicaragua also already come with ideologies that align very much traditionally with the Republican Party, particularly anti-communism, right? So many Latinx individuals are going to support Trump because Trump is part of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party has traditionally been against communism. So that's one reason. The other reason is because so many Latinx individuals are racist themselves, right? And racist in Latin America before coming to the US, and then sort of once many of us come to the US, we then build on that racism that we bring, and then add with the racism that exists in the United States, right? So many Latinx individuals have very strong anti-Black positions, right? And that have their roots in Latin America and also in the United States. And so Trump is appealing to that anti-Black and anti-immigrant attitude of many Latinx individuals. And it's ironic, of course, because as humans, we're all full of contradictions, and Latinx individuals are the same, right? So why would someone who is a person of color then, discriminate against other people of color? Again, because of the way in which racism, and particularly anti-Black racism works, which is that it privileges not just whiteness, but white proximity to whiteness, right? So again, I could go on and on, but I'm just going to end there. And hopefully that helped explain it.
Great, thank you. And this question is for Professor O'Brien. Can you explain more about how the Republican platform can incorporate religion in their agenda if there's separation of church and state?
How the Republican Party can incorporate religion?
Right. How does that go together with this idea of the separation of church and state?
Well, I think they focus on founding fathers and this idea of religious freedom. And I'm not convinced they want a full separation of church and state. It's one thing to say that and another than to enact policies that really show religious state ties being part of their platform and part of their voting base. And I do think from my talk, as I was saying, with democratization versus authoritarianism, there is a lot of research out there that cautions us with confusing or conflating religious freedom for people to worship whatever faith they have, with religious state ties. And this is where I do think the Republican Party being pushed to the far right is moving towards religious state ties versus separation of church and state, or separation of religion and state. And there's plenty of research on this. One journal I will recommend to you, I have right here actually, Politics and Religion. And there are several pieces throughout the years in this journal on, for instance, one by Casas and Holman, Religion, Gendered Authority, and Identity in American Politics. Another one by Castle, Authoritarianism and Public Opinion on Church and State in the US. There is a danger of religious state ties bringing us more towards authoritarianism versus democratization. And this is also supported by research in my own department at San Diego State, Professor Ahmet Kuru, who's also with the Center of Islamic Studies at San Diego State. And his research on Islam, authoritarianism, and underdevelopment in the Middle East region. And if we look historically over time and place across regions, where you see religious state ties, when and where they crop up, that's where you see a decline in democratization. You also see a decline in economic innovation. You also see repression of intellectuals. So it's no surprise that the far right is wedded to the far right religious conservatives who deny science, who deny gender existing. They actually call gender ideology evil. In the United Nations, there's a backlash to gender ideology even, and a backlash from the far right, including the US, promoted by the Republican Party, the Vatican, conservative non-governmental organizations, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, the League of Arab States, the UN Africa Group, and certain post-Soviet Catholic and Islamic states that oppose gender equality. They oppose what they call gender ideology, which is really anti-science, it's anti-women's rights, and it's anti-LGBT rights. So I would say it is dangerous to promote religious state ties and conflate that with religious freedom. I think a platform, whether it's Republican Party or Democratic Party or any party, religious freedom is a must in a democracy, but that should not be at the expense of human rights of LGBTQ persons, the diverse array of women that we have, and the diversity of people in general.
Thank you. I'm going to now answer sort of a cluster of questions for me. I'll read them. How do we have a system of checks and balances if Amy Coney Barrett is to be confirmed when Merrick Garland wasn't? Can Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation be blocked? If she is confirmed, what options are available to Biden and Democrats if Biden is elected? So the question about checks and balances in terms of the Supreme Court is an interesting one. And, you know, really the Constitution gives the appointment of Supreme Court justices to the president. You know, the Senate and how the Senate should function in it is just stated as an advisory role. And so it is a system of checks and balances, but one in which the president has power over the court in terms of appointment. And so, you know, we have these ways of characterizing our Constitution and ideals. One is checks and balances, one is separation of church and state. That the reason we go to college and we learn these things is to be able to see beyond these characterizations to the often unfair complexity. Can her confirmation be blocked? I doubt it, unless a whole bunch of Republican senators on the Judiciary Committee have to be hospitalized for COVID and can't have a quorum. I mean, short of the inability to call a quorum, I don't think that it can be blocked. And in terms of, to me, the most interesting part is if or when she is confirmed. And there's a 6-3 very conservative Federalist Society majority on the Supreme Court interested in getting a lot of laws passed by Congress. What options are available? Well, you know, one option is what people call court packing, but it's court expansion, because the Constitution doesn't say anything about the size of the court. Or about term limits for court justices. So there could be some court reform. 2 or 4 additional justices could be added. Term limits could be put into place. That would make so one person's, I mean, it is interesting that so many aspects of law that have been passed by Congress are in jeopardy because of the death of one person, which suggests the Supreme Court is not a very robust institution if it's that fragile to overturn consensus, particularly when a majority of justices will now be appointed by presidents who weren't democratically elected, if you take into account the popular vote. Other issues would involve changing the Senate, possibly by statehood for DC, and if they won it, Puerto Rico, which would change the composition of the Senate. And so the Senate would more reflect would be more democratic, because right now it's so heavily biased toward rural and therefore white states. And so that would be another point for change. But those are really difficult changes. I think that we will have a lot of legislating from the Supreme Court in ways that will that I will not agree with. Let's put it that way. So thank you very much for that question. And I hope please continue to send in your questions. Here's another question from Megan. If the proposition were to be passed, would California be one of the only states where previously incarcerated folks have their voting rights restored?
That's a good question. I believe that we're kind of reaching a tipping point where we're approaching a majority of states have some rights, but California has certainly been a leader on other aspects of criminal legal reform. And it's exciting to see these initiatives and to have them become more commonplace. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so Victoria, can you talk about voter registration in the Latinx community and how that factors into this election?
So this may be, I don't know exactly where the question is coming from, but there's so many different things happening, right? For the general population, but particularly efforts on the part of the Republicans and Trump supporters, of course, to suppress voting in general for all of us, right? But of course, the populations that are most vulnerable are those that are in areas of the country that are surrounded by, well, let me say one thing. One is that, of course, right, the more low-income populations are more vulnerable, right? And of course, they tend to target those populations. So that is one of the things that's happening, but that's affecting not only, a lot of the things that affect Latinx voters also affect other voters, right? In part because of intersectionality, in part because, of course, so many of us are under attack. So that is part of what is happening in terms of efforts to mobilize Latinx voters. That has been ongoing, right? And so you have certainly someone like Bernie Sanders created a lot of grassroots momentum for voting among Latinx voters. There are even, documentaries about this, etc. And so there's a lot of excitement at the grassroots level, right, in terms of voting. And some of that is being done in terms of the voting efforts is being done by specifically Latinx organizations. And some of that is being done, of course, by the Democratic local parties and at the national level. And some of that is the excitement that was created in part by particularly by the Bernie campaign, which had attracted a great percentage of particularly young Latinx voters, right? And part of that may or may not be, because of, teaming up with individuals like Cardi B, for example, et cetera. So at this point, a lot of it will have to do with how many voters show up to the polls. And again, that is an issue that we're all confronting.
Okay, thank you very much. Cheryl, I have a question for you. Can you say more about feminist foreign policy and the implications of this election for that?
Yes, feminist foreign policy, that's a concept that came out of Sweden originally when they declared that they have feminist foreign policy. And ideally, feminist policy, foreign policy would focus on eliminating systemic inequalities, having sustainable environmental and economic development, human rights, and these kinds of things globally. In terms of foreign policy, with this election, I mentioned, for example, the global gag rule. I mentioned the United Nations and the U.S. far right implications globally for women's rights as well as LGBTQ rights there. But also this broader issue of religious state ties, I think, is very important when we think of foreign policy. And religious state ties in terms of cozying up to religious elites who are authoritarian and anti-feminist. Some religious elites, for example, use the tropes that Trump uses, and this kind of big manism that he's been getting away with in the US. In Nigeria, there's a term called big manism. It's basically looking at male leaders who have a kind of authoritarian style rule, and they think they're everything, and they have big egos. And when I've traveled, even in the work I've done in Senegal, I was there this past year doing work and research, and people have asked me from different walks of life about how did the US elect Trump? Like we didn't expect a kind of big manism coming from a US president after they had just, observed Obama more recently. And I think this authoritarian thread, authoritarianism, the far right, racism, anti-feminism, these have a thread in terms of maintaining kind of hierarchies. And there's even research on anti-LGBTQ rights and anti-feminism research in terms of public opinions, finding ties between authoritarianism, ways of thinking, and racism. And those doing that research are calling it like social dominance orientation, this idea of preserving hierarchy. And I think in terms of feminist foreign policy, the fact that Trump has cozied up to authoritarian leaders, right? Like Putin, who actually, his regime has weakened anti-domestic violence legislation. You have other authoritarian leaders, of course, that Trump has cozied up to, and that the far right religious and the far right in general have cozied up to, who have called feminism evil and evil ideology. They have called discussions of gender evil also, and as threats to national security somehow. So this is a thread that is over time in place. I think foreign policy wise, it's clearly anti-feminist, and feminist foreign policy would certainly not be a part of this. I would also want to add, for feminist foreign policy, there are implications. We had a great speaker through the Women's Studies Department in the last few years, Joni Seeger, and she talked about, for instance, far right ideology and how national movements, they don't like to be told what to do. So you see an authoritarian style ruler in the far right in Brazil, where the rainforest is being cut down at alarming rates. under this leader and saying, well, we can do what we want. And this tilt towards corporations, hyper-masculinism, and hyper-corporate or hyper-capitalism. So really favors, fossil fuel industries and the corporate state ties there. We see Trump, for instance, appointed for NOAA, which is the national agency that part of its duties is to examine and analyze climate and present forecasts based on data and facts. Well, he appointed more recently an anti-scientist who is a scientist. He has doctor in front of his name, but he does non-peer-reviewed research that's funded by the fossil fuel industry, and that actually challenges climate change and challenges human-caused climate change. So I would say the implications in terms of feminist foreign policy, when ideally you would have sustainable development, caring about the environment for one, whereas nationalism and putting America first is just very inward looking and looking at fossil fuels and how I can make a buck. And they stand at odds with each other. Those who really care about climate change, you need to think long-term. And I think that's an issue your generation, the younger generation, really needs to be concerned about. I know some students and people, even within my own family, are one-issue voters. And one-issue voters, I find, tend to be focused on things like abortion. Then what I would ask you to do in terms of feminist foreign policy, or even if that is your one issue you decide to vote on, think about how do we prevent abortion then? Well, you would prevent abortion by empowering women, giving women more bargaining power in their relationships with husbands, regardless of the country. And that requires feminist foreign policy. That requires also feminist policies, domestic side. That requires affordable, accessible birth control. However, the policies that those on the far right that promote anti-abortion only as the way to vote, they do not support affordable birth control. So you really need to ask yourself, is that actually going to solve the problem if I'm a one-issue voter? Or do I want to look at the bigger picture and how can I decrease demand for abortion, if that's your issue? So a lot there, but hopefully that answers the question. Thank you.
Great. And to wind it up, Victoria, you're going to take us out. I have a little cluster of questions for you that you can answer. One of them is, can you explain why Puerto Ricans can't vote if they're in American territory? And the second one is, why is the leader of Proud Boys Latinx doesn't make that group not white supremacist?
Again, very good question about Puerto Rico. So this is a theme, right, in US. I'm a historian, so I always, start way back. So I promise I won't take up too much time. But this is a theme where the United States has taken over lands of peoples where they want the land and they want the free labor, but they don't really want those people, of course, to have equal rights, right? And so that's what happened with New Mexico. That's why New Mexico, didn't actually become a state until 1912. This is in California, of course, even though it was full of indigenous peoples and people who identified as Mexican or Spanish or Californios at the time. The reason why it became a state right away is because of gold, right? So unless there's something there that merits, giving individuals citizenship, then it's not going to happen, right? Of course, many of us believe that Puerto Rico has a quasi-colonial status and that it qualifies for that label. But in Puerto Rico, like everywhere else, people are divided, right? And so this creates a very difficult situation politically for Puerto Ricans who are living on the island. Now, after the recent hurricane, many Puerto Ricans had to leave because of all the issues with infrastructure. So I think some of you remember that Trump even at one point put forth the possibility of selling Puerto Rico, right? He wants to get rid of, because he thinks of everything as well, he's a real estate person, right? As he himself says, and therefore it's all about buying and selling, whether it's humans or land or whatever, whether it's something that doesn't belong to him or not, right? In any case, that is why Puerto Ricans are not, who live on the island are not able to vote, because the United States has purposefully decided that they do not qualify as equals to those of us who live on the mainland and in Hawaii. So there's that. And what was the other part of the Puerto Rico question? Was that it?
That was it.
Okay.
Just provide that explanation.
Yeah. So then, of course, though, if you live on the mainland, so Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens from birth, right? And again, we tend to forget that just because the whole thing is just so really absurd, right? Okay. So again, Puerto Ricans who live on the mainland, then they are able to vote for president in regular elections in the United States. Okay. And then the other question has to do with this right-wing group called the Proud Boys, right, which of course gained even more publicity during the presidential debate that just recently took place. And so many people are interested in knowing, well, how come if one of their leaders is Afro-Cuban and identifies as Afro-Cuban, right, and was born in the United States in Miami, grew up in Little Havana, how come, this can be considered a white supremacist group? And so I really like to focus on this example because it points again to, one, just human contradictions in every human person's life, right? One. Two, it points to what many of us have pointed out from the beginning, which is the contradictions inherent in identity politics, right? So those of us who set up identity politics as a straw man, right? Then they fail to acknowledge that feminists and those of us on the left are the first to argue that identity politics is fraught with contradictions, right? So it's not linear. It's not because, I am a woman, therefore I am going to be a feminist. It never happens in a linear way, right? It's very, very complicated and complex because all humans are complicated and complex. And so that's exactly what happens with the Latinx population also, right? And so in fact, this individual, and his name is Enrique Tarrio, this one of the leaders of the Proud Boys, not only is he just mentioned, right, Afro-Cuban, and he's acknowledges that, but he also has a criminal record, right? And so he puts forth this very complicated sort of set of ideas where he is in favor of criminal justice reform, and yet he also supports strongly the Second Amendment, right? And so I think it's important to highlight individuals like him because, again, it is possible to affiliate yourself with ideologies that at first glance appear to not have your best interest in mind, right? And in fact, may not have your best interest in mind. And yet again, all of us on a daily basis sometimes do things that don't necessarily benefit us, right, in the long term. And this just goes to show again that some of us will value certain themes in our lives more than others, depending on where we're at in our life cycle. So I'll just end with that. Oh, you know what? Let me just say one more thing. Sorry, which is this. The other thing that I really want to point out is that I think one of the things that happens is that when we think of Latinx individuals in the U.S. and Latin Americans, also we are so stereotypes permeate how we think of these populations, okay? And most of those stereotypes have a tiny little bit of truth and a huge percentage of falsehoods to it. So oftentimes we think that that somehow there are inherent characteristics that Latinx people have. And one of those that we often put forth is this idea that somehow we are more authoritarian, that we're more willing to vote and elect and embrace and support authoritarian leaders, right? And I just wanted to make sure that nobody left this presentation believing that, right? So again, and I think that Professor O'Brien mentioned this, right, in terms of who ends up supporting authoritarian leaders is very complex. Right, and there's nothing about Latin America that sort of indicates that we inherently support these these leaders, right? And that somehow then would translate into Latinx individuals supporting Trump. And ironically, right? Ironically, it's actually the United States who has funded and supported most authoritarian leaders in Latin America, creating this loop, this endless loop, right, of falsehoods and misinformation and propaganda that then portrays people of Latin American ancestry continuously as inferior. And so I wanted to end with that. Thank you.
Well, let's end our entire session with that. Thanks again to all of our speakers. Really fascinating and illuminating conversation. I really appreciate everybody and your insights. My dear colleagues, so smart, so generous with your time and your thoughts. And thank you to all of you who attended for your good questions and for just taking the time to listen to us share our thoughts with you. I wish all of you a very good day and a good rest of the semester, and keep your fingers crossed for November 3rd. That's it. Thanks.